In the vast deserts of pre-Islamic Arabia, a single arrow would ignite 4 decades of unrelenting bloodshed. The year is 494 AD, and 2 powerful cousin tribes stand at peace. Yet within hours, that fragile peace would shatter into one of history's most bewildering conflicts. A war sparked not by territorial ambitions, not by political rivalries, but by the killing of a camel. For 40 years, the Banu Taghlib and Banu Bakr tribes would wage relentless warfare across Arabian sands. Brothers would fight brothers, fathers would lose sons, and entire generations would know nothing but vengeance. This is the story of the War of Al-Basus, where honor demanded blood and pride refused reconciliation. It reveals the unforgiving code that governed pre-Islamic Arabian society, where even trivial insults spawned catastrophic consequences. Today, we journey into the harsh world of 6th century Arabia, where tribal identity trumped all considerations. We will meet Kulayb ibn Rabiah, the arrogant chieftain whose cruelty set events in motion irreversibly. We encounter Al-Basus, the elderly woman whose grief would give this conflict its enduring name forever. And we witness how Jassas ibn Murrah's single act of revenge condemned 2 tribes to generational warfare. This documentary examines how a moment of brutality against an animal escalated into humanity's darkest impulses. We explore the battles, the poetry, the failed peace attempts that characterized this extraordinary tribal conflict. Most importantly, we discover what this war reveals about honor, vengeance, and the destructive power of pride. The War of Al-Basus stands as history's ultimate cautionary tale against allowing anger to eclipse reason itself. The Arabian Peninsula in the late 5th century was a harsh realm of scorching deserts and scarce resources. Across the Najd region, nomadic Bedouin tribes wandered endlessly, seeking precious water sources and grazing lands for livestock. These tribes traced their lineage through complex genealogies that defined their identities, alliances, and bitter ancient rivalries. Life in this unforgiving environment demanded strict adherence to tribal codes that governed every aspect of existence. 2 tribes dominated the central Arabian landscape during this tumultuous period of pre-Islamic history and conflict. The Banu Taghlib and Banu Bakr were cousin tribes, both descended from the legendary patriarch Wa'il. Their shared ancestry created bonds of kinship, yet also fueled intense competition for honor and regional supremacy. Both tribes belonged to the powerful Rabiah Confederation, tracing their descent through Adnan to Prophet Ishmael himself. The Banu Taghlib had established themselves as perhaps the most formidable force in northern and central Arabia. Their warriors were renowned for exceptional combat skills, their poets celebrated throughout the region for eloquent verses. They had embraced Miaphysite Christianity centuries earlier, though many pre-Islamic customs remained deeply embedded in their culture. The tribe's solidarity was legendary, with members organizing into massive battle formations that intimidated opponents across Arabia. The Banu Bakr, their cousin tribe, commanded equal respect throughout the Arabian Peninsula's shifting tribal landscape. Subdivided into numerous clans, including the powerful Banu Shayban, they controlled vast territories in central Arabia. Their warriors matched the Taghlib in courage and martial prowess, their honor code equally uncompromising and absolute. Relations between these cousin tribes had always been complex, mixing cooperation with underlying tension and mutual suspicion. By the late 5th century, a precarious balance of power existed between these 2 mighty tribes. They shared grazing lands, watering holes, and trade routes that crisscrossed the desolate Najd region's harsh terrain. Their leaders occasionally intermarried, creating family bonds meant to cement peace between these perpetually competitive cousins. Yet beneath this surface cooperation simmered old grievances, territorial disputes, and questions about which tribe truly dominated. The tribal honor code, that governed Arabian society was absolute, unforgiving, and brutally demanding in its expectations. Any insult to a tribe member, no matter how small, was considered an attack on the entire tribe. This principle of collective responsibility meant that individual actions could trigger massive conflicts involving thousands of warriors. Blood vengeance was not merely acceptable, but mandatory, with honor demanding that no offense go unpunished or unavenged. In this world, livestock represented far more than simple economic assets or sources of sustenance and survival. Camels especially symbolized wealth, status, and family honor in ways modern societies struggle to fully comprehend today. A prized camel could be worth more than a man's life in the harsh calculus of desert survival. To harm another's camel without cause was to attack their honor, their livelihood, and their family's standing. The stage was set for catastrophe in 494 as two tribes camped near one another. What should have been a time of friendly reunion between cousins would instead become history's most infamous beginning. In these tense circumstances, a single moment of cruelty would unleash 40 years of relentless bloodshed and suffering. The War of Basus was about to begin, and the Arabian Peninsula would never be the same. Kulayb ibn Rabiah dominated the Banu Taghlib tribe with an iron will and an arrogance that alienated many. He was a chieftain of extraordinary power, the first among the Adnanites to claim royal authority over them. Under his leadership, the Taghlib had achieved unprecedented dominance across the northern and central Arabian territories they controlled. Yet Kulayb's character combined brilliance with a fatal flaw that would ultimately doom him and his people. His territorial possessiveness bordered on tyranny as he claimed absolute control over every resource in Taghlib lands. No camel could drink from his wells without permission. No tribe could graze their herds without his approval. This obsessive control earned him respect, mixed with growing resentment from both his own people and neighbors. Even his wife Jalila, sister to the Bakr leader Jassas, found his domineering nature increasingly difficult to tolerate. In the spring of 494, the Banu Bakr and Banu Taghlib camped together near traditional grazing grounds. This gathering should have been peaceful, a time for cousins to reconnect and celebrate their shared ancestry. Among the Bakr visitors was an elderly noblewoman named Al-Basus bint Munkidh, visiting her nephew Jassas ibn Murrah. She had traveled with a prized she-camel, a beautiful red animal that represented her wealth and family status. The camel wandered from the Bakr encampment one scorching afternoon, drawn by thirst toward Kulayb's watering hole. It was a natural behavior for livestock in that harsh environment where water meant life or death. The she-camel had recently given birth and needed water desperately to produce milk for her young calf. She approached the well that Kulayb guarded jealously, unaware she was crossing an invisible boundary of tribal territory. Kulayb spotted the foreign camel drinking from his well without permission, and his rage erupted like desert lightning. He seized his bow immediately, fitting an arrow with hands that trembled with indignation and territorial fury. The chieftain took careful aim at the she-camel, drawing the bowstring back with deliberate, vengeful intention clearly visible. His arrow flew true, piercing the camel's udder and causing the animal to collapse in agony. Al-Basus heard her camel's dying cries and rushed to the scene, arriving to find blood spreading across sand. The elderly woman fell to her knees beside her dying animal, grief overwhelming her in devastating, uncontrollable waves. She tore off her veil in the traditional gesture of dishonored womanhood, crying out for justice and retribution. Her anguished wails echoed across the camp, a sound that would resonate through Arabian history for centuries ahead. This was not merely the death of an animal, but a profound violation of hospitality and honor. Al-Basus was a guest under her nephew's protection, and this attack dishonored both her and the entire tribe. In Arabian custom, a host's guests were sacrosanct, protected by bonds more binding than written laws or treaties. Kulayb had committed an unforgivable act, showing contempt for these sacred traditions that held society together precariously. The elderly woman composed a poem on the spot, her words burning with humiliation and demands for vengeance. She recited verses that questioned whether any man of honor remained among the Banu Bakr tribe members. Her poetry challenged her nephew Jassas directly, asking if he would allow his aunt's dignity to be trampled. These words would echo in Jassas's mind, growing louder with each passing hour until action became inevitable. Jassas ibn Murrah found himself trapped between impossible choices that would define the rest of his life. On one side stood his brother-in-law, Kulayb, married to his beloved sister Jalila in a bond of family. On the other side stood tribal honor, the sacred duty to protect guests and avenge insults to family. The young warrior spent sleepless nights wrestling with this dilemma, knowing any choice would bring catastrophic consequences inevitably. Yet the honor code was absolute in its demands, allowing no compromise or middle ground for resolution. To ignore Al-Basus's call for justice would mark Jassas as cowardly, dishonoring him and destroying his reputation. His sister's marriage bonds could not supersede the blood ties and sacred hospitality obligations he owed his aunt. Kulayb had crossed a line that demanded blood in response, regardless of family connections or political considerations. Jassas made his decision with a heavy heart, understanding fully that this moment would change everything irreversibly forever. He would avenge his aunt's honor, uphold the sacred code, and accept whatever terrible consequences followed from this. The young warrior began preparing himself mentally and physically for what he knew must come next, inevitably and soon. A single arrow had set events in motion that no power on earth could now prevent or halt. Jassas ibn Murrah tracked his brother-in-law across the wilderness with the focused determination of a desert hunter. He found Kulayb alone one day, away from the protection of his warriors and vulnerable to attack. The Taghlib chieftain never suspected that his wife's brother would approach him with murderous intent and deadly purpose. Kulayb's arrogance had blinded him to the consequences of his actions and the vengeance he had provoked. Jassas approached Kulayb from behind, spear in hand, his heart pounding with dread and grim resolve combined. With one powerful thrust, he drove the weapon into Kulayb's back, a cowardly strike that would haunt him forever. The mighty chieftain fell, mortally wounded, blood staining the desert sand as life drained rapidly from his body. Kulayb lay dying in the wilderness, screaming for help that would not arrive in time to save him. A shepherd boy heard the chieftain's agonized cries and rushed to his side with water and compassion. Kulayb begged the boy to examine his wound, to tell him whether death was approaching or survival possible. The shepherd initially refused, terrified of becoming involved in such a momentous and dangerous tribal matter ahead. But the dying chieftain insisted, and the boy finally examined the wound with trembling hands and growing horror. The spear had pierced vital organs, ensuring death was inevitable no matter what aid might now be offered. Kulayb's rage flared even in his final moments, cursing the Banu Bakr and demanding vengeance from beyond death. With his remaining strength, he called for his brother Abu Layla al-Muhalhel to avenge this treacherous murder. According to legend, he either recited a poem or wrote his dying message in blood on nearby rocks. The poem that Kulayb recited became one of the most famous death verses in pre-Islamic Arabian literary history. His words demanded that his brother lead the Taghlib in an unending campaign of vengeance against Bakr. These dying instructions would bind al-Muhalhel to a 40-year quest for revenge that would consume his entire life. The chieftain's last breath carried a curse that would condemn thousands to death in the decades ahead. News of Kulayb's assassination spread across the camps like wildfire, igniting immediate outrage among the Banu Taghlib warriors. The tribe had lost its powerful leader to what they considered a cowardly attack from a trusted brother-in-law. Kulayb's widow Jalila found herself in an impossible position, torn between blood loyalty and marriage bonds forever severed. The Taghlib elders moved swiftly to exile her from the tribe, as her brother's treachery had severed all connection. Abu Layla al-Muhalhel, known as the weaver of fine poems, had led a life of luxury and poetry. He was Kulayb's younger brother, a man more interested in verse and romance than warfare and tribal leadership. His nickname Al-Zir, meaning the philanderer, reflected his reputation for pursuing women and avoiding political responsibilities entirely and completely. But his brother's murder transformed him instantly into a vengeful warrior determined to fulfill his dying brother's wishes. Al-Muhalhel assumed leadership of the Banu Taghlib with a single-minded focus on avenging his brother's death immediately. He composed poetry that transformed grief into rage, turning personal loss into tribal war cries that mobilized warriors. His verses became legendary throughout Arabia, immortalizing the War of Basus in poetic form for future generations ahead. The new chieftain swore oaths that bound him to pursue vengeance until every drop of blood was repaid. The Banu Bakr understood immediately that Kulayb's death meant war, inevitable and unavoidable regardless of their wishes now. Jassas himself wrestled with guilt and justification, knowing he had upheld honor while destroying peace between cousin tribes. Tribal leaders on both sides attempted brief negotiations, but the honor code made compromise impossible at this stage. Blood had been spilled, and only more blood could satisfy the demands of justice as these tribes understood it. The transformation from peace to war occurred with terrifying speed as both tribes mobilized their fighting forces rapidly. Warriors sharpened swords and prepared horses, poets composed battle songs, and families prepared for the coming storm ahead. The elders who might have counseled restraint found themselves powerless against the tide of rage and honor demands. Within weeks of Kulayb's death, the first major battle of the War of Basus would drench Arabian sands with blood. Historians would later marvel at how a killed camel and a murdered chieftain could spawn 4 decades of warfare. Yet for the participants, the logic was clear and unquestionable according to the values that governed their lives. Honor demanded vengeance, vengeance demanded blood, and blood demanded more blood in an endless cycle of retaliation and suffering. The War of Basus had truly begun, and neither tribe could imagine the terrible price they would ultimately pay. The first major confrontation occurred on a day forever remembered as Yawm al-Hazr in Arabian tribal memory and poetry. Al-Muhalhel led the Banu Taghlib warriors in a devastating assault against the Banu Shayban subdivision of Bakr tribe. The Taghlib forces swept across the battlefield like a desert storm, overwhelming their opponents with superior coordination and numbers. Casualties among the Banu Shayban were catastrophic, with dozens of warriors falling to Taghlib swords and spears relentlessly. This initial victory emboldened the Taghlib, convincing them that the war would be short and decisively in their favor. Al-Muhalhel's leadership proved effective despite his lack of previous military experience or tactical training in warfare arts. His burning desire for vengeance transformed him from a pleasure-seeking poet into a formidable military commander overnight and completely. The Taghlib warriors fought with exceptional ferocity, driven by grief for their fallen leader and hunger for retribution. Days after Yawm al-Hazr, the Taghlib forces confronted the Zubayd tribe, potential allies of the Banu Bakr. This encounter ended without significant bloodshed, as the Zubayd wisely chose to remain neutral in this expanding conflict. But the Taghlib continued their aggressive campaign, hunting down Banu Shayban groups across the Najd region's vast territories. They killed another important Banu Shayban leader, further cementing their early dominance in this escalating tribal warfare. The Banu Bakr leadership realized quickly that the Banu Shayban subdivision could not stand alone against Taghlib might. Urgent calls went out to all Bakr subdivisions, demanding they unite against this existential threat to their tribe. The response was overwhelming as warriors flooded in from across central Arabia to defend their kinsmen and honor. What had begun as a conflict between two sub-tribes now expanded into a full-scale war between massive tribal confederations. The Bakr forces achieved their first significant victory on a day remembered as Yawm al-Istirad in tribal chronicles. They ambushed and killed a notorious Taghlib criminal, showing that they could strike back effectively against their enemies. This victory, though small, provided crucial morale to the Bakr warriors who had suffered heavy losses in earlier engagements. It demonstrated that the Taghlib were not invincible despite their early successes and superior organizational cohesion in battle. Internal divisions plagued both tribes as the war dragged on month after month with no resolution in sight. Some Bakr subdivisions grew weary of the constant warfare and attempted to withdraw from the conflict entirely and completely. This infuriated the Bakr chieftain Kulayb ibn Murrah, who publicly shamed those seeking peace as cowards and traitors. His passionate speeches and poetry eventually convinced the wavering clans to recommit to the war effort fully and completely. The conflict quickly established a brutal pattern that would characterize the entire 40-year struggle between these tribes. Raids and counter-raids occurred constantly, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory that might end hostilities. Warriors on both sides grew up knowing nothing but war, their entire lives defined by this endless cycle of violence. Children who had been infants when Kulayb died became warriors themselves, fighting enemies they had never known in peace. Poetry emerged as one of the war's most powerful weapons, with both sides employing verse to motivate and inspire. Al-Muhalhel's compositions were particularly famous, combining exceptional literary artistry with devastating emotional power and impact throughout Arabia. His poems mourned fallen warriors, celebrated victories, mocked enemies, and kept the flame of vengeance burning bright and hot. These verses were memorized and recited around campfires, ensuring that no one forgot why they fought or what was at stake. The Banu Taghlib maintained military superiority during these early years through better organization and more experienced leadership available to them. They controlled more territory, commanded more allies, and possessed the resources necessary to sustain prolonged military operations effectively and ruthlessly. Yet the Banu Bakr proved remarkably resilient, absorbing losses and rebuilding their forces with impressive speed and determination always. Each setback only seemed to strengthen their resolve to continue fighting until honor was satisfied or they were destroyed. Trading caravans that had crossed the region for centuries found their routes disrupted by constant tribal warfare everywhere. The economic costs of the conflict mounted steadily as commerce suffered and valuable resources were diverted to military needs. Grazing lands that both tribes had shared became contested battlegrounds where neither side could safely pasture their herds any longer. The quality of life deteriorated for everyone involved, yet the honor code demanded that fighting continue regardless of cost. External observers watched this conflict with a mixture of fascination and horror at the tribes' stubborn refusal to seek peace. Some tribes attempted to mediate, but both Taghlib and Bakr leaders rejected all overtures as dishonorable and impossible to accept. The regional balance of power began shifting as this war consumed two of Arabia's most powerful and influential tribes. Yet neither side could see beyond their immediate desire for vengeance to the long-term consequences that were becoming apparent. As the war entered its second decade, a generation had now grown up knowing nothing but endless conflict. Young warriors fought battles their fathers had started, avenging deaths from raids they had never personally witnessed themselves before. The original cause of the war, the killed camel and Kulayb's murder, seemed almost irrelevant now to many. Yet the machinery of vengeance continued grinding forward, each death demanding another death in the eternal cycle of retaliation. The poetry produced during these years provides our most detailed record of specific battles and individual acts of heroism. Verses describe fierce duels between champions, desperate cavalry charges, and the agony of mothers losing their beloved sons. These poems were not mere entertainment, but historical records preserved orally through generations before being written down centuries later. They reveal the human cost of the war in ways that dry historical accounts could never adequately capture or convey. Al-Muhalhel continued leading the Taghlib forces with unwavering determination despite the mounting toll on his own tribe's resources. His poetry grew darker as years passed, reflecting the psychological burden of commanding a war with no end visible. He had transformed completely from the pleasure-loving poet of his youth into a hardened warrior, consumed by vengeance utterly. Yet his military skills remained formidable, and under his leadership, the Taghlib continued dominating most of the major engagements. The Banu Bakr endured catastrophic losses during these middle years, with entire clans nearly wiped out completely by Taghlib raids. But they possessed a resilience and determination that frustrated every Taghlib attempt to achieve final, decisive victory over them. Whenever al-Muhalhel thought victory was near, the Bakr would regroup, rally reinforcements, and launch devastating counterattacks unexpectedly and effectively. This resilience would ultimately prove decisive as the war entered its third and fourth decades of endless bloodshed. One of the war's most tragic episodes involved Al-Harith ibn Abad, a chieftain of a tribe allied with Bakr. Al-Harith had attempted to remain neutral, believing this war was foolish and would destroy all parties involved inevitably and completely. He kept his warriors out of the fighting despite pressure from Bakr leaders to join their cause fully. But neutrality proved impossible to maintain as the conflict's scope expanded to engulf all tribes in the region. Al-Harith made a desperate attempt to end the bloodshed by sending his own son, Bujar, as a peace emissary. In Arabian tradition, sending a son of high status as a hostage was a powerful peace gesture demonstrating sincere intentions. Bujar went to al-Muhalhel, carrying proposals for negotiation, blood money payment, and an end to the endless vengeance cycle. The young man believed that even al-Muhalhel's hardened heart might be moved by such a dramatic gesture of goodwill. But al-Muhalhel's response shocked all of Arabia and revealed how completely vengeance had consumed his soul and judgment. Instead of accepting the peace offering, he declared that Bujar's life was worth merely Kulayb's shoelace, nothing more significant. With those contemptuous words, al-Muhalhel personally killed the peace emissary, violating one of Arabia's most sacred customs completely. This act of brutality demonstrated that no negotiation or compromise would be acceptable to the Taghlib leader ever again. Al-Harith ibn Abad's grief transformed instantly into towering rage at this unprecedented violation of diplomatic protocol and honor. He composed a famous poem of 40 verses declaring his full entry into the war on the side of Bakr. The grieving father ordered his warriors to shave their heads and cut their horses' manes as gestures of mourning. This tradition of showing grief through altered appearance became standard practice among Arabs following Al-Harith's heartbreaking example perfectly. Al-Harith swore a terrible oath that would become famous throughout Arabian history for its dramatic nature and consequences. He vowed never to speak to any member of the Taghlib tribe until the earth itself spoke to him. This oath bound him to relentless warfare, but also created a condition that seemed to guarantee perpetual conflict forever. Only through a clever trick would this oath eventually be fulfilled decades later during the war's final resolution. The entry of Al-Harith and his warriors into the conflict tipped the balance significantly toward the Banu Bakr's side. Fresh troops, burning with desire to avenge Bujayah's murder, reinvigorated the exhausted Bakr forces with new energy and determination. Al-Harith proved to be an exceptional military commander, leading successful raids that inflicted serious casualties on the Taghlib warriors. For the first time, the Taghlib found themselves genuinely struggling to maintain the military superiority they had enjoyed previously. The war reached new levels of savagery as both sides abandoned any remaining restraints on their conduct and military operations. Raids targeted not just warriors, but entire encampments, with women and children sometimes caught in the devastating violence unleashed. Prisoners were rarely taken, as neither side trusted their enemies to honor traditional rules about hostage treatment or release. The conflict had devolved into something approaching total war, with both tribes fighting for survival rather than mere honor. Agricultural settlements that had existed for generations were destroyed, their residents forced to flee or face death from raiders. Water sources became battlegrounds as both sides sought to deny their enemies access to this most precious resource in deserts. Livestock herds were stolen or slaughtered, destroying the economic foundations that had sustained these tribes for countless centuries before. The land itself seemed to suffer, its ancient peace shattered by this seemingly endless human conflict and stubborn refusal to reconcile. By the war's 20th year, voices calling for peace grew louder among the rank and file on both sides. Warriors who had fought since youth now approached middle age, exhausted by decades of constant warfare and mounting losses. But the leadership remained committed to vengeance, and the honor code made retreat or compromise seem impossible to consider seriously. The machinery of war had acquired its own terrible momentum that no one seemed capable of stopping or even slowing. The Battle of Yawm al-Tahaluk marked the beginning of the end for Banu Taghlib military dominance in the conflict. This decisive engagement saw the reinvigorated Bakr forces, strengthened by Al-Harith's warriors, achieve a crushing victory over their enemies. The Taghlib suffered catastrophic casualties, losing many of their most experienced warriors and military commanders in a single disastrous day. Al-Muhalhel barely escaped with his life, the first time the mighty warrior had faced personal defeat so completely and decisively. The psychological impact of this defeat was perhaps even more devastating than the physical losses suffered by Taghlib warriors. For 2 decades, they had considered themselves militarily superior, confident that final victory would eventually come their way inevitably. Now that certainty had been shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that they might actually lose this war entirely. Morale among Taghlib fighters plummeted as they contemplated the possibility of total defeat and tribal destruction looming ahead ominously. Following Yawm al-Tahaluk, al-Muhalhel made the painful decision to abandon the Najd region that had been Taghlib homeland forever. The bulk of the tribe gathered their remaining possessions and began a mass exodus toward the lower Euphrates region. This migration represented an admission of defeat, even though fighting would continue sporadically for years ahead in different territories. The Taghlib settled among the Namir ibn Qasid tribe, their kinsmen, beginning a new chapter of their existence in exile. The Banu Bakr celebrated this victory as vindication of their decades-long resistance against the initially superior Taghlib forces. Finally, they had endured catastrophic losses, survived near destruction, and ultimately forced their enemies to abandon their ancestral homeland completely. Yet the cost had been staggering beyond calculation, with thousands dead and the tribe's resources depleted almost entirely by warfare. Leaders on both sides began privately questioning whether the victory was worth the terrible price that had been paid. During this period, the broader political landscape of Arabia was also undergoing significant changes that affected the conflict. The Kindite kingdom was rising to power in central and northern Arabia under King Al-Harith ibn Amr ibn Hujr. Both the Taghlib and Bakr found themselves becoming subjects of this new regional power that demanded their allegiance immediately. Al-Harith attempted to broker peace between the warring tribes as part of establishing his authority across Arabian territories. The Kindite king partially succeeded in reducing hostilities, though true peace remained elusive due to deep-seated tribal resentments festering. Fighting decreased in intensity, becoming more sporadic raids rather than the large-scale battles that had characterized earlier years. Both tribes focused increasingly on establishing themselves under the new Kindite political order, rather than pursuing old vendettas constantly. Yet the embers of hatred continued smoldering, waiting for opportunities to flare into violence once again when circumstances allowed. After Al-Harith's death around 530, his sons Shurabil and Salama contested the Kindite throne fiercely and violently. The old tribal alignments reasserted themselves, with Taghlib supporting Salama and Bakr backing Shurabil in this succession struggle rapidly. This civil war within the Kindite kingdom provided both tribes new avenues to continue their ancient feud, indirectly and partially. They fought each other again, but now under the banner of competing royal claimants rather than their own direct conflict. Al-Muhalhel continued commanding Taghlib forces during these final years, though age and exhaustion were taking their inevitable toll on him. The once brilliant warrior and poet found himself increasingly isolated, his single-minded pursuit of vengeance having cost him dearly and completely. According to tradition, he was eventually captured by the Madhij tribe in southern Arabia and forced to marry one of their women. This humiliating end for the great war leader symbolized how completely the Taghlib had fallen from their earlier glory days. The fighting finally began subsiding significantly by the early 530s as both tribes approached complete exhaustion utterly. A generation had fought and died, followed by another generation, and still the war had achieved nothing but mutual destruction. The original participants were all dead now, including the main protagonists who had started this catastrophic conflict decades before. Young warriors continued the fight because it was all they knew, but the passion that had fueled earlier battles had largely dissipated. Tribal elders on both sides began seriously discussing peace terms, though pride made formal negotiations difficult to arrange successfully. Neither tribe wanted to be seen as surrendering or admitting they had been wrong to pursue vengeance for decades. Yet the practical reality was that both tribes had been devastated and needed peace desperately to rebuild and survive ahead. The question was not whether the war would end, but how to end it in a way that satisfied honor requirements. The involvement of neutral arbitrators became crucial, particularly King Mundir III of the Lakhmid dynasty at Hira city-state. As ruler of an important Arab client state under Persian Sasanian Empire protection, Mundir commanded respect from both tribes. He offered to mediate a peace settlement that would allow both sides to claim they had satisfied their honor completely. His political power and diplomatic skills proved essential in finally bringing this destructive conflict toward a conclusion at last. The peace negotiations required careful handling of the blood debt calculations that had accumulated over 4 decades of warfare. Traditional Arabian law required that deaths be counted and blood money paid to families who had lost warriors unnecessarily. The final reckoning revealed casualties so high that both sides were shocked at the true cost of their stubborn refusal to reconcile. Thousands had died, entire clans had been wiped out, and the economic devastation would take generations to repair fully. By 534, exactly 40 years after Kulayb's murder, both tribes were ready for peace at almost any cost. The Taghlib had been driven from their homeland and reduced to a shadow of their former power and glory days. The Bakr had won the military struggle, but at such terrible cost that victory felt hollow and pyrrhic rather than triumphant. The stage was finally set for the war's conclusion through a combination of exhaustion, mediation, and clever diplomacy. The formal peace negotiations took place at the Du al-Majaz market near Mecca, a neutral territory respected throughout Arabia. Representatives from both tribes gathered under the watchful eyes of King Mundhir and other regional leaders, ensuring fair negotiations proceeded smoothly. The terms required both sides to formally renounce further violence and accept blood money payments for outstanding debts still owed. Most importantly, both tribes had to publicly declare that their honor had been satisfied fully and completely forevermore. Al-Harith ibn Abad's oath presented a unique problem, as he had vowed never to speak to Taghlib until Earth spoke. This seemingly impossible condition threatened to prevent a final peace settlement despite both sides' desperate desire to end hostilities. But the Taghlib devised a clever solution that satisfied the letter of the oath while allowing reconciliation to proceed finally. They dug a trench along a road where Al-Harith regularly passed, hiding a man inside to call out poetic pleas. When Al-Harith passed by, a voice seemed to come from the earth itself, singing verses, asking for forgiveness and peace. The trench-hidden Taghlib warrior recited poetry, acknowledging the suffering both sides had endured for 4 decades of bloodshed. Al-Harith recognized the clever trick immediately, but accepted it as satisfying the technical terms of his sacred oath completely. The earth had indeed spoken to him, allowing him to finally break his silence and participate in peace negotiations. This creative solution demonstrated how desperately both sides wanted peace, willing to employ theatrical tricks to satisfy honor requirements. Al-Harith's acceptance of this symbolic fulfillment allowed him to formally address the Taghlib and negotiate terms with them directly. His participation proved crucial, as he commanded great respect among both Bakr and their allies who had joined the war. Without his approval, many Bakr warriors would have refused to accept any peace settlement, regardless of official tribal decisions. The final peace terms included substantial blood money payments from both sides to families who had lost warriors during the conflict. The Taghlib agreed to pay significantly more, acknowledging their role in initiating the conflict through Kulayb's original aggression and arrogance. These payments, calculated in camels and other valuable goods, represented enormous financial burdens for both tribes to bear ahead. Yet both sides accepted these terms willingly, recognizing that continued warfare would destroy them both completely and utterly beyond recovery. An additional condition required both tribes to formally acknowledge past wrongs and pledge never to renew hostilities against each other. Public ceremonies were held where leaders from both sides embraced, recited poetry of reconciliation, and shared sacred meals together. These symbolic gestures were crucial in Arabian culture, transforming enemies into people who had shared salt and therefore owed mutual protection. The rituals helped ordinary warriors on both sides accept the peace emotionally, not just intellectually through formal treaty agreements. The peace settlement also established new territorial boundaries, recognizing the changed reality created by 40 years of warfare and displacement. The Taghlib acknowledged their permanent loss of the Najd homeland, accepting their new territories near the Euphrates River region. The Bakr gained control over lands they had contested for decades, their military victory now officially recognized and legitimized finally. These territorial adjustments prevented future disputes over grazing rights and water sources that might reignite the conflict accidentally later. King Mundir's role as guarantor of the peace proved essential, as both tribes trusted him to enforce terms impartially. He threatened severe consequences for whichever side violated the treaty first, including military intervention from the Lakhmid kingdom itself. This external enforcement mechanism provided security that prevented hot-headed warriors from reigniting the conflict through unauthorized raids or violence. The presence of this powerful neutral arbiter allowed both tribes to accept peace without fearing they appeared weak or cowardly. Poetry played a crucial role in cementing the peace, just as it had fueled the war for decades past. Poets from both tribes composed verses celebrating reconciliation, mourning the fallen, and praising the wisdom of ending pointless bloodshed. These poems were memorized and recited at gatherings, gradually shifting tribal memory from glorifying vengeance to valuing peace and stability. The same medium that had preserved hatred now worked to preserve friendship and mutual respect between former deadly enemies. Some warriors on both sides struggled to accept the peace, feeling that their fallen comrades had been betrayed somehow. Young men who had spent their entire lives training for war against Bakr or Taghlib found purpose suddenly stripped away. Tribal elders worked patiently to help these warriors understand that continuing the conflict would dishonor those who had already died. The fallen had sacrificed everything for tribal survival, and survival now required peace rather than further self-destructive vengeance and warfare. The economic recovery from 40 years of warfare required decades of sustained effort and cooperation between the former enemy tribes. Livestock herds had to be rebuilt from depleted breeding stock, requiring careful management and occasionally trading between former enemies carefully. Agricultural settlements that had been abandoned or destroyed needed new inhabitants and investment to become productive again and sustainable. Trade routes that had been disrupted gradually reopened as merchants gained confidence that tribal warfare would not endanger their caravans anymore. The demographic impact of the war was staggering, with both tribes having lost significant percentages of their male population entirely. This imbalance created social challenges as widows and orphans struggled to survive without the traditional male protectors and providers. Both tribes adapted by allowing widows greater independence and property rights than had been customary in traditional Arabian society before. These social changes, born of necessity, gradually became accepted practices that outlasted the immediate crisis that had created them. The War of Basus entered Arabian collective memory as the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked vengeance. Poets and storytellers kept the tale alive, using it to warn future generations about allowing pride to escalate minor disputes. The phrase, War of Basus, became proverbial throughout Arabia, invoked whenever conflicts threatened to spiral out of control unnecessarily and destructively. Parents used the story to teach children about the importance of forgiveness, restraint, and considering consequences before acting rashly. The historical documentation of this war provides invaluable insights into pre-Islamic Arabian society and its complex honor codes governing behavior. The poetry produced during the conflict represents some of the finest examples of classical Arabic literature from this era's golden age. These verses were eventually compiled in collections like the Mu'allaqat and other anthologies, preserving them for future scholars to study carefully. Without the War of Basus, much of what we know about 6th century Arabian tribal life would have been lost forever. Archaeological evidence from the Najd region shows signs of the widespread destruction and displacement described in historical accounts and poetry. Abandoned settlements from this period suggest rapid population movements consistent with the Taghlib exodus described in traditional histories and legends. Material culture changes reflect the economic hardship that accompanied 40 years of continuous warfare and resource depletion across the region. These physical remains corroborate the literary sources, confirming that the War of Basus was indeed as destructive as tradition claims. The War of Basus became the most famous tribal conflict in pre-Islamic Arabian history and culture forever. This 40-year struggle between the Banu Taghlib and Banu Bakr tribes of Arabia transformed how Arabs understood honor and vengeance. The Arabian tribes who witnessed this catastrophe learned crucial lessons about the destructive power of unchecked tribal pride and revenge. These two cousin tribes from the Rabiah Confederation had destroyed themselves over a camel and a chieftain's arrogance completely. The Arabian tribal system of pre-Islamic times was built on strict codes of honor that governed every aspect of life. Among the desert tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, any insult to a tribe member demanded immediate and violent retaliation without exception. The Bedouin tribes who wandered Arabia's deserts lived by these unforgiving codes that prioritized honor above all other considerations entirely. But the War of Basus showed Arabian society how these tribal traditions could lead to complete self-destruction when taken to extremes. We see the same escalation dynamics, the same honor-driven violence, the same difficulty finding off-ramps from self-destructive conflict cycles everywhere. Understanding this ancient war helps us recognize these patterns in contemporary situations before they spiral into equally catastrophic outcomes for all. The real question is whether modern societies have truly learned from Basus, or whether we continue repeating its mistakes unnecessarily. The War of Basus ended not with glorious victory, but with mutual exhaustion and a recognition that pride costs too much. Both tribes survived, though forever diminished, carrying scars and memories that would shape Arabian culture for centuries ahead into the future. Their poetry preserved both the glory and the horror, ensuring that future generations would understand the full cost of unchecked vengeance. From the ashes of this conflict would eventually rise a new civilization that explicitly rejected the tribal codes that had caused such destruction. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of pre-Islamic Arabia's most extraordinary conflicts and learned something valuable from it today, please like this video and subscribe to Unleash Facts for more comprehensive historical documentaries that bring the past to life. Your support helps us continue creating thoroughly researched content that explores the fascinating stories and crucial lessons hidden throughout human history. Thank you for spending these 50 minutes with us, exploring 40 years of history that changed Arabia forever and still resonates today. Until next time, remember that understanding the past helps us navigate the present and build a wiser future for all humanity.